The kindness of a stranger. The cold wind sliced through Nathaniel's coat as he stepped out of the towering glass doors of Harrington & Co., the corporate law firm where he had worked for the past 5 years. The December air carried the scent of snow, though the streets were still dry under the city's dimmed streetlights. Nathaniel was exhausted. The week had been relentless, filled with endless paperwork, back-to-back client calls, and the usual office politics that came with corporate law. He adjusted his scarf and started his walk toward the subway station, his thoughts occupied with nothing more than the promise of a warm meal and the comfort of his tiny apartment. Then he saw her. She sat on the cold concrete sidewalk near the entrance of an abandoned bookstore. A young girl, barely in her late teens, wrapped in a tattered coat that did little to shield her from the brutal cold. Her knees were pulled close to her chest, her face partially hidden behind a mess of tangled curls. A torn, faded backpack rested beside her, the only possession she seemed to have. Nathaniel had seen her before, at this very spot. For nearly 2 weeks, he had passed by the same street corner, always noticing the girl but never stopping. He, like so many others, had told himself that someone else would help her. Someone else would stop. Someone else would care. But today, something inside him shifted. He couldn't just keep walking. With a deep breath, Nathaniel changed direction, stepping into Sam's Diner, the old family-owned restaurant across the street. The warm scent of fresh bread and roasted coffee enveloped him as he walked inside. Back again so soon, Nate. Sam, the elderly owner, greeted him with a knowing smile from behind the counter. "Not for me," Nathaniel replied, hesitating for only a moment before continuing. "I need something hot. A meal for someone outside." Sam's smile faded as he glanced out the window, instantly understanding. Without another word, he turned to the kitchen and called out an order. Within minutes, a steaming bowl of chicken soup, a thick turkey sandwich, and a cup of rich, hot cocoa were placed into a brown paper bag. Nathaniel paid quickly and left, his heart pounding slightly as he approached the girl. He cleared his throat. "Hey," he said softly, keeping a respectful distance. "I thought you might be hungry." The girl flinched, her wide, dark eyes darting toward him with suspicion. She didn't say anything, only tightened her grip on her coat. Nathaniel hesitated but held out the bag. "It's still hot. No strings attached, I promise." For a moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, her fingers, red from the cold, reached out and took the bag. She peered inside, and her expression softened ever so slightly at the sight of the food. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathaniel offered a small smile. "I'm Nathaniel," he introduced himself, though he didn't expect her to offer her name in return. She hesitated again before responding. "Veronica." It was the first thing she had willingly given him. Her name. Nathaniel nodded. "Nice to meet you, Veronica." She said nothing more but took a careful sip of the hot cocoa, closing her eyes briefly as the warmth spread through her. Nathaniel wanted to say more, to ask her why she was out here, to figure out how he could help, but he knew better than to push. Instead, he settled onto a nearby bench, keeping a comfortable distance while she ate in silence. The world moved around them. Cars sped past. People walked briskly by. The city lights flickered, but in that small moment, it was just Nathaniel and Veronica, sharing an unspoken understanding. After a while, she looked up at him. "Why?" she asked. He blinked. "Why what?" "Why did you stop today?" Her voice held an edge of cautious curiosity. "You've walked past me before." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I guess I got tired of pretending I didn't see you." Veronica studied him for a long moment before looking away. "Most people do," she said quietly. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten. How many people had ignored her before him? How many had walked past without a second thought? His hands clenched in his coat pockets. You shouldn't have to be out here, he said after a moment. Veronica's lips curved into something that was almost a smirk, but not quite. And yet, here I am. The silence stretched again, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Eventually, Veronica wrapped the rest of her sandwich and tucked it carefully into her backpack, as if saving it for later. I should go, she said, shifting to stand. Nathaniel stood as well. Will you be here tomorrow? He asked before he could stop himself. She looked at him, brow furrowed in confusion. Why? Because I'd like to bring you another meal, he answered simply. If that's okay. Veronica hesitated again. Trust didn't come easily, not for someone like her. But after a long pause, she gave a small nod. Same time? She asked, her voice uncertain. Nathaniel smiled. Same time. As he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just begun. A fragile trust. Nathaniel walked the same path home the next evening, his eyes searching for the familiar figure in the shadows. A part of him worried she wouldn't be there, that she had moved on, or that she had changed her mind. But then he saw her. Veronica was in the same spot, sitting against the brick wall of the abandoned bookstore, wrapped tightly in her tattered coat. Relief flooded through him as he stepped into Sam's diner once more. This time, he ordered a warm stew, cornbread, and another cup of hot cocoa. He also picked up a small bag of fresh fruit, apples and bananas. When he approached her, Veronica didn't flinch like the night before. She still held a cautious expression, but there was a glimmer of recognition in her eyes. I thought you might be hungry, Nathaniel said, handing her the food. She took the bag with slightly less hesitation than last time, pulling out the cup of cocoa first. She wrapped her hands around it, savoring its warmth. Thanks, she murmured, but there was something different in her voice this time, less guarded. Nathaniel sat on the same bench nearby, letting her eat in silence. After a few minutes, Veronica glanced at the bag and pulled out the apple. She stared at it for a moment before looking up at him. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. I know, Nathaniel replied simply. She studied him for a long moment. Then why? Nathaniel exhaled, thinking carefully. Because I can, he finally said. Because I want to. Veronica took a slow bite of the apple. Most people don't care. Nathaniel leaned back on the bench, watching her. I think more people care than you realize, he said. They just don't always know how to help. Veronica snorted softly. Helping isn't that complicated. Food, shelter, safety. It's not rocket science. Nathaniel nodded. Fair point. They sat in silence again, the cold city air wrapping around them. Finally, he asked, How long have you been out here? Veronica hesitated, fingers tightening around the apple. A while. Since your mom. Nathaniel trailed off, unsure if he should finish the sentence. Veronica nodded, her expression unreadable. She got sick, really sick. The hospital bills took everything. We lost our apartment. And after she swallowed hard. After she was gone, I had nowhere to go. Nathaniel's chest tightened. You don't have any other family. She gave a short, humorless laugh. No one who gives a damn. His jaw clenched at the bitterness in her tone. He wanted to say something, to offer some kind of solution. But he knew better. Veronica had survived this long on her own. The last thing she needed was someone swooping in to save her. Instead, he said, If you ever need anything, anything at all, you can tell me. Veronica looked up, and for the first time, there was something raw in her eyes. Something vulnerable. Why do you care? She asked, her voice almost challenging. Nathaniel held her gaze. Because I see you, he said simply. Something in her expression flickered. Maybe no one had ever told her that before. Veronica dropped her gaze, finishing the rest of her meal in silence. But she didn't push him away. And that was enough. For now. An unlikely invitation. Over the next week, Nathaniel continued bringing Veronica dinner every evening. He learned little things about her, how she liked her hot cocoa, extra sweet, how she always saved part of her meal for later, how she could recognize which restaurant he'd visited just by the smell of the food. One night, as he handed her a warm sandwich and soup, she asked, "Why are you dressed nicer than usual?" Nathaniel chuckled. "Office holiday party. Everyone's required to go." She smirked. "Sounds miserable." "It usually is," he admitted. Veronica pulled her blanket tighter around herself. "So why go?" He shrugged. "Free food." That earned a small laugh from her. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he said, "You should come with me." Veronica froze mid-bite. "What?" "The holiday party. There'll be tons of food, warmth, music. You'd like it." She stared at him like he'd just suggested something completely ridiculous. "You want to take a homeless girl to your fancy office party?" Nathaniel met her gaze without hesitation. "I want to take my friend to my office party." Her expression shifted, guarded, uncertain. "I don't belong at something like that," she muttered. "Says who?" Veronica scoffed. "Literally everyone." Nathaniel shook his head. "I don't care what anyone else thinks. You deserve a warm, safe place to spend the evening." She looked down at her lap, her fingers gripping the fabric of her coat. "I don't have anything to wear," she finally whispered. Nathaniel smiled. "That's an easy fix. The first step towards something new." The next day, Nathaniel did something he hadn't done in years. He walked into a thrift shop and picked out an outfit for someone other than himself. A simple but elegant navy blue dress, a soft scarf, a pair of warm tights. He wasn't sure what Veronica's style was, but he figured warm and comfortable was a safe bet. That evening, when he met her at their usual spot, he handed her the bag. "What's this?" she asked, eyes narrowing. Nathaniel exhaled. "Just something for the party. If you don't like it, no pressure. But I thought you might want something a little warmer." Veronica hesitated. Then, slowly, she reached for the bag and peered inside. She pulled out the dress, running her fingers over the soft fabric. Her expression was unreadable. "I haven't worn something this nice in a long time," she admitted quietly. "You don't have to come," Nathaniel said quickly. "I don't want you to feel pressured. But if you do come, I promise, I'll stay by your side the whole time." Veronica clutched the dress in her hands, staring at it like it was something fragile. Finally, she whispered, "Okay." Nathaniel blinked. "Okay." She nodded. "I'll come." For the first time in a long while, Veronica had somewhere to be. A night of truths. The night of the holiday party arrived with an early December snowfall, the city's streets dusted in white. Nathaniel waited outside his office building, his hands stuffed into his pockets as he anxiously checked the time. He had been worried all day, worried she would change her mind, worried she wouldn't show up. Then, through the soft flurry of snowflakes, he saw her. Veronica walked slowly toward him, shoulders hunched against the cold. She wore the navy blue dress he had given her, her tangled hair brushed for the first time in who knows how long. The scarf was wrapped snugly around her neck, and she clutched the edges of her coat like it was a shield. Nathaniel let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You look great," he said, offering a warm smile. Veronica shrugged, looking down at herself. "I feel like an imposter." Nathaniel chuckled. "You're not. I promise." She shivered slightly, eyeing the grand entrance of the Harrington & Co. building. "Are you sure about this?" Nathaniel nodded. "Absolutely." Taking a deep breath, Veronica followed him inside. A world that wasn't meant for her. The moment she stepped into the grand ballroom on the upper floor, Veronica felt like she had crashed into another universe. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over the sea of well-dressed guests. Men in sleek suits, women in elegant evening gowns, glasses clinking, laughter filling the air. Everything was too polished, too refined, too far from the world she knew. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her scarf. She didn't belong here. Nathaniel must have sensed her tension because he leaned in and whispered, "Remember what I said. I'm right here. We stay as long as you want. And if you want to leave, we go. No questions asked. Veronica exhaled, nodding slightly. A waiter passed by with a tray of appetizers, and she caught the rich aroma of freshly baked pastries. Her stomach growled before she could stop it. Nathaniel grinned. Come on, let's get you some real food. As they made their way toward the buffet, a woman in a silver gown approached, her bright red lipsticks standing out against her pale skin. Nathaniel, she cooed, who's your lovely friend? Veronica stiffened. Nathaniel smiled, unfazed. Sarah, this is Veronica. Sarah's gaze flickered over her outfit before settling on her face. Veronica, I don't think I've seen you around before. Veronica swallowed, but before she could answer, Nathaniel smoothly replied, she's a close friend. We've known each other for a while. Sarah's perfectly arched eyebrow lifted slightly, but she didn't press. Well, it's lovely to meet you, Veronica. She walked away, and Veronica exhaled sharply. I told you, she muttered. People will know I don't belong. Nathaniel grabbed 2 plates from the buffet table and handed one to her. Sarah doesn't know anything about you. She just likes to be nosy. Veronica sighed, reluctantly taking the plate. She focused on the warm, delicious food, trying to ignore the creeping self-consciousness that gnawed at her insides. For the first time in a long while, she ate without rationing each bite, without worrying about whether this meal needed to last her through the night. And despite everything, the overwhelming luxury, the feeling of being out of place, she found herself relaxing. That was, until the moment that changed everything. The unexpected encounter. The music changed, shifting to a soft, jazzy tune as the room quieted for the grand entrance of Richard Harrington, the CEO of the firm. Nathaniel straightened. Here comes the boss. Veronica barely paid attention. She was focused on the cheesecake in front of her, savoring every bite. Then she heard a voice, deep, familiar, and so unexpected that it sent a jolt down her spine. Veronica. She froze, the fork slipping from her fingers. No, it couldn't be. Slowly, almost fearfully, she turned her head toward the voice. And there he was. Richard Harrington. Tall, refined, the man whose face had been burned into her childhood memories. The father she had lost. The father who had never come for her. The room blurred around her, the noise fading into a deafening silence. Nathaniel's confused voice barely registered. Veronica, what's wrong? Richard stepped closer, his own face pale with shock. I thought I lost you, he breathed, his voice shaking. All these years, I thought. Veronica felt her entire world tilt on its axis. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. She wanted to scream, wanted to ask him where he had been, wanted to demand why he had never looked for her. But all she could do was stare at the man she once called Dad, the man she had thought had abandoned her. Then, without a word, she turned and ran. The aftermath. Nathaniel chased after her. Veronica, wait. She didn't stop running. She tore through the opulent hallways, past the shocked guests, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Nathaniel caught up to her just outside the building, his hand catching her arm. She whirled around, eyes blazing. That's him, she spat. That's my father. Nathaniel's breath hitched. Wait, what? Veronica's heart pounded as the memories came rushing back. Her childhood before everything fell apart, the nights she waited in the hospital for her father to show up, the crushing realization that he never did. He left me, she whispered, her voice breaking. After Mom died, I waited. I waited for him to come, but he never did. Nathaniel's grip on her arm softened, his face full of concern. Veronica, maybe. Don't, she snapped. Don't tell me he had a reason. Don't tell me he didn't know where I was. She yanked herself away from him, wrapping her arms around herself. Nathaniel sighed. What if, just for a second, you let him explain? Veronica shook her head, anger and hurt swirling inside her like a storm. I don't need his explanations." She turned away, her whole body trembling from more than just the cold. Nathaniel didn't try to stop her this time. He just watched as she disappeared into the night. The weight of the past, running from the truth. Veronica's footsteps echoed against the wet pavement as she sprinted down the empty street. Her lungs burned. Her heart pounded. Her thoughts swirled into a storm she couldn't control. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. All she knew was that she had to get away. Away from that room full of strangers. Away from Nathaniel's concerned gaze. Away from him. Her father. Her father, who had left her to rot on the streets. Her father, who had stood there in his expensive suit, in his perfect, polished world, while she had slept in alleyways, shivering in the cold. Tears stung her eyes as she ducked into a side alley, leaning against the damp brick wall. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her mind reeled with memories she had spent years trying to forget. A childhood lost. She had been 10 years old when everything fell apart. Her mother, Sarah Matthews, had been everything to her, her warmth, her safety, her entire world. When her mother got sick, everything changed. The hospital visits, the whispered conversations with doctors, the overdue bills piling up on the kitchen counter. Then, one night, her mother was gone. Veronica had sat in that hospital room for hours, clutching the corner of her mother's blanket, waiting. Waiting for someone to come. Waiting for him to come. But he never did. Instead, the social workers came. Instead, she was told she had no one to take care of her. Instead, she was thrown into the foster system, bouncing from home to home, until she finally ran. And now, after all these years, after everything she had been through, her father had just walked back into her life, like nothing had happened, like he hadn't left her alone in the world. Veronica slid down the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. The cold seeped through her dress, but she barely felt it. How dare he look at her like that? Like he missed her, like he had been searching for her. She clenched her fists. It was a lie. It had to be. Because if it wasn't, if there was even a chance that he had been looking for her, then that meant she had wasted years of her life hating him for nothing. And that was a truth she wasn't ready to face. Nathaniel's choice. Nathaniel didn't go after her. He wanted to. Everything in him screamed to chase after her, to make sure she was safe. But he knew Veronica. She needed space. So, instead, he did the next best thing. He went back inside. The party had settled back into its rhythm, but Richard Harrington stood frozen near the entrance, his expression unreadable. Nathaniel walked straight up to him. "You need to talk to her." Richard turned sharply, as if just realizing Nathaniel was there. His face was pale, his hands trembling slightly. "You know her?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Nathaniel nodded. "I do." Richard exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. "I can't believe it," he whispered. I thought she was gone. All these years, I thought." Nathaniel crossed his arms. "She thinks you abandoned her." Richard flinched as if he had been physically struck. "She?" His throat tightened. No, I didn't. I searched everywhere. I hired investigators. I checked hospitals, shelters, schools." Nathaniel studied the man carefully. He looked broken. Not the cold, emotionless CEO he had always imagined. Just a father who had lost his daughter. And then Nathaniel asked the only question that mattered. What happened? The truth unfolds. Richard sat heavily in a nearby chair, rubbing his temples. He swallowed hard. "Sarah and I. We were divorced when Veronica was still young." Nathaniel nodded. He had pieced that much together. "She had full custody," Richard continued. I fought for visitation, but Sarah, she didn't want me in Veronica's life." Nathaniel frowned. "Why?" Richard's hands clenched into fists. "She thought it would be easier for Veronica. She thought." He exhaled. "She thought I was too busy. That I wasn't the father Veronica needed. His voice cracked. She told the courts I was emotionally unavailable. That my work came first. Nathaniel's heart clenched. He could only imagine what it must have been like to love your child, but to be kept away from them. I sent letters, Richard murmured. Cards. Birthday presents. They were all returned. Nathaniel's mind flashed back to Veronica's words from their first conversation. He wasn't there when I needed him. He never came. Then, when Sarah got sick, I didn't even know, Richard continued. His voice was thick with regret. I found out from a lawyer weeks later. By the time I reached out to the hospital, Veronica was already gone. Nathaniel's breath caught. She was put in foster care, Richard whispered. I tried to fight for her. I filed emergency custody paperwork, but he looked away. By the time the courts responded, she had already run away. Nathaniel sat back, stunned. She thought you abandoned her, he murmured. All these years, she thought you didn't want her. Richard's eyes filled with raw pain. I never stopped looking, he whispered. Not for a single day. A confrontation years in the making. Nathaniel didn't give Veronica the full story right away. Instead, he waited. He knew she would come back to their meeting spot. And 2 days later, she did. She was angry. He could see it in the way she crossed her arms, the tension in her jaw. I'm not going to him, she snapped before Nathaniel could even speak. Nathaniel sighed. Veronica. No, she said sharply. I don't care what excuse he gave you. Nathaniel frowned. Don't you at least want to hear what he has to say? Veronica clenched her fists. I don't need his lies, she spat. Nathaniel shook his head. What if they're not lies? She flinched. What if he really did look for you? Nathaniel pressed. What if he's been trying to find you this whole time? She glared at him, but he could see the cracks in her armor. Finally, her voice wavered. What if I can't forgive him? Nathaniel's heart softened. Then don't, he said simply, but at least hear him out. Because if there's even a chance that you've spent all these years hating a man who never stopped loving you, don't you deserve to know? Veronica's lips parted slightly. For the first time, she didn't have a response. And that was when Nathaniel knew. She was going to see him. She just wasn't ready to admit it yet. The weight of the past. The decision to confront the past. Veronica didn't sleep that night. She sat in the tiny alcove she called shelter, a half-abandoned alleyway behind an old bookstore, her mind racing. Nathaniel's words haunted her. If there's even a chance that you've spent all these years hating a man who never stopped loving you, don't you deserve to know? She wanted to push the thought away, bury it deep under the years of resentment she had carefully built. But she couldn't. Because the truth was, a part of her wanted to know. Even if she wasn't ready to forgive. Even if it didn't change the past. So the next morning, with a tight knot of fear in her stomach, she made her choice. She was going to face him. She was going to get the truth. And then she was going to walk away. For good. The meeting that changed everything. Nathaniel had arranged for them to meet in a small cafe on the edge of the city. Neutral ground. Veronica arrived first. She hated that her hands were trembling. She hated that she felt nervous. She had spent years training herself not to care. But as soon as the door swung open and Richard Harrington walked in, her stomach twisted into knots. He looked older than she remembered. The last time she had seen him, she had been 10 years old, staring at a courtroom full of strangers while social workers whispered about where she would go next. Now, his once dark hair had streaks of silver. His face, always so sharp and polished in her memory, was lined with something heavier. Regret. Pain. Veronica, he breathed, stopping a few feet from the table. She straightened her back. She would not break. I don't know why I'm here, she said coldly. Richard swallowed. Because you deserve to hear the truth. She clenched her fists under the table. And what truth is that? Richard hesitated. His eyes, so much like hers, were filled with something raw. I never abandoned you. Her body stiffened. Liar. Her whole life, she had lived with that truth that he had left her. And now he just expected her to believe otherwise. You didn't come for me, she snapped. I waited. I waited in that hospital room, Dad. The word came out like a bitter curse. I waited, and you never came. Richard's face crumpled. Veronica, I was in Seattle for a business meeting when the accident happened, he said. There was a storm. The flights were grounded. By the time I got back, you were gone. Her heart thudded painfully. No, she whispered. She didn't want this to be true. She didn't want to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong. I fought for you, Richard continued, his voice shaking. I filed for emergency custody. I did everything I could to find you. But the system, his jaw clenched, you had already run. She squeezed her eyes shut. That was true. She had run. After a year of bouncing between foster homes, she had decided she was better off on her own. I searched everywhere, Richard whispered. I hired private investigators. I checked shelters, hospitals. Every lead I got ended in nothing. Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. But how could she? How could she let go of all that pain? How do I know you're telling the truth? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a worn leather notebook. Carefully, he placed it on the table between them. Veronica frowned. What is this? Everything, Richard said softly. Hesitantly, she picked it up and flipped to the first page. Her breath caught. It was a journal. The first entry was dated just days after she had disappeared. Veronica, I don't know where you are tonight. I don't know if you are safe, if you have food, if you are warm. But I swear to you, I will find you. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. There were notes from private investigators, hospital records he had searched, a list of every shelter he had visited. Each entry was filled with desperate words. Another dead end today, but I won't stop looking. It's been 5 years. God, I hope you are alive. Please, if you ever read this, know that I never gave up on you. Tears blurred her vision. This wasn't just words. This was proof. He had looked for her. He had never stopped. The anger she had held onto for so long began to crack under the weight of the truth. Richard watched her, his own eyes glistening. I lost everything, he whispered. I lost you. And I never stopped trying to get you back. Veronica squeezed the notebook in her hands, her heart aching. So much time lost. So much pain that could have been avoided. And yet, I don't know how to forgive you, she admitted, her voice small. Richard nodded. I don't expect you to, he said gently. But I'm here, if you ever want to try. She looked down at the journal. For the first time in years, she didn't feel lost. Maybe, just maybe, she had a home to return to after all. The fractured pieces of a family. A silent goodbye or a new beginning. Veronica didn't speak as she left the cafe. The weight of the journal in her hands felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. She had spent years hating her father. She had built an entire identity around the belief that he had abandoned her. But now that belief was shattering. Nathaniel walked beside her in silence. He knew better than to push. She barely noticed when they reached their usual spot, the place where he had first found her, sitting on the cold pavement, clutching her worn-out backpack. It felt like a lifetime ago. Now she stood at a crossroads. Should she believe Richard? Should she even try? She lowered herself onto the bench, flipping open the leather notebook once more. Her eyes scanned the pages. Each word felt like a knife cutting through everything she had thought was true. She had spent so long running from ghosts. Now, one of those ghosts was real, and he was reaching out. You don't have to decide today, Nathaniel said gently. Veronica swallowed hard. No, but she had to decide soon. Because deep down she knew, if she walked away now, she might never have the courage to come back. A step toward the past. The next evening, she made her choice. She didn't tell Nathaniel. She didn't even tell herself until the last second. She simply found herself standing in front of Richard's townhouse, her breath clouding the air as she stared up at the expensive brownstone. For a long time, she couldn't move. What was she even doing here? She should turn around. She should. The door opened. Richard stood there, his face weary, as if he had been waiting. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Then, finally, Richard stepped aside. "You can come in," he said softly. And against all reason, against all the fear in her chest, she did. A house full of memories. Veronica stepped inside and immediately felt like she had stepped into a stranger's life. The place was immaculate, expensive but not extravagant. Framed photos lined the walls. For a moment, she didn't dare look at them, because if she did, she might see a life she could have had, one that had been stolen from her. She clenched her fists. This wasn't a home. Not to her. "Are you hungry?" Richard asked hesitantly. She was, but she wasn't ready to accept anything from him yet. "I'm fine." Richard nodded. "Can I show you something?" She didn't answer, but he took her silence as permission. He led her to a small study, warm, filled with books and papers, and in the center of the room was a single wooden box. Richard knelt and opened it, his hands trembling. Inside were letters. Hundreds of them. Addressed to her. Veronica's breath caught. "I wrote you every year," Richard murmured. "On your birthday. On Christmas. Whenever I missed you." She hesitated. Then, carefully, she reached down and picked up the top letter. "Happy 12th birthday, Veronica. I don't know where you are. I don't know if you're safe. But I hope you are. I hope." Her chest tightened. This was real. The words were real. He had never forgotten her. For so long, she had convinced herself that she had been unwanted. But this was proof that she had been loved. She suddenly felt exposed. She wasn't ready. Not yet. Veronica stood abruptly. "I should go." Richard's face fell, but he nodded. "I understand." And to her surprise, he didn't stop her. He let her walk away. But this time, she wasn't running. The scandal that changed everything. 2 days later, the headlines broke. CEO under unnoticed IJJ Lyon for FRAD. Harrington and CO in Curais. Veronica froze. She stared at the article in shock. Her father was being accused of embezzling millions from the company. Her father, the man she was just starting to believe in. Her hand shook as she scrolled through the article. Anonymous sources. Allegations of missing funds. A full investigation underway. Nathaniel burst into the alleyway, breathless. "You saw." She nodded numbly. "This isn't right," he said. "Something's off." Veronica couldn't breathe. Had she been wrong about him? Had she trusted him only to be betrayed again? Or was he being framed? Her mind raced. She had to find out. Because if there was one thing she had learned, it was that the truth was rarely simple. The fight for truth. A father's reputation on the line. A headline burned in Veronica's mind as she stood on the icy sidewalk, gripping her phone tightly. CEO under unnoticed IJJ for FRAD. Richard Harrington, ACCUSED of EMBZLING millions. It didn't make sense. She had spent her entire life hating this man for leaving her. Now, when she was finally starting to believe he had never stopped looking for her, this happened. Was this the universe's cruel way of telling her she had been right all along? Or was there more to the story? Nathaniel was watching her carefully. "This isn't adding up, Veronica." She clenched her jaw. "I need to see him." Nathaniel hesitated. "Are you sure?" No. She wasn't sure about anything. But she had spent too many years living with lies. She needed the truth. She needed to hear it from him. The visit that changed everything. Veronica arrived at her father's townhouse later that evening. This time, she didn't hesitate. She knocked, hard. The door opened almost instantly, as if Richard had been waiting. His face was pale, tired. "Veronica," he breathed. "Tell me the truth," she cut in, her voice sharp. "Did you do it?" Richard flinched, as if the question had physically hurt him. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. She followed him inside. For the first time, she noticed the exhaustion in his eyes. His usually immaculate study was a mess of papers and folders. It looked like he had been fighting a battle long before the world even noticed. "I didn't steal a dime," Richard said finally, sinking into a chair. "But someone wants to make it look like I did." Veronica studied him, searching for any sign of a lie. For years, she had thought of him as a stranger. But now she saw a man who was barely holding on. Nathaniel had told her to trust her instincts. So she did. And everything inside her told her that her father was telling the truth. "Who would do this?" she asked, crossing her arms. Richard exhaled. "That's what I'm trying to find out." Veronica glanced at the papers scattered across his desk. "Then let's find out together." Richard looked up, his expression unreadable. "You'd help me." She hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think I would." Unraveling the mystery. Veronica and Nathaniel spent the next 2 days digging through records. Nathaniel's job at the law firm meant he had access to case files and financial statements. And something wasn't adding up. "We found something," Nathaniel said, dropping a folder onto Richard's desk. Richard frowned, flipping through the papers. "These transactions," Nathaniel said, "they were approved while you were out of the country." Richard's face darkened. Someone had been signing documents in his name. Veronica clenched her fists. Who had access to this? Richard set the papers down, rubbing his temples. "There's only one person who could have done this." Veronica and Nathaniel exchanged glances. "Marcus Henderson," Richard said darkly. Veronica's breath caught. Marcus Henderson, the vice president of Harrington and Co., the man who had been working under Richard for years. Nathaniel ran a hand through his hair. "I've seen his name pop up in fraud cases before." Veronica's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a setup. This was a takeover. "Someone is trying to destroy you," she whispered. Richard's eyes met hers. They almost did. But almost wasn't good enough. Not this time. The confrontation. The next morning, Richard called an emergency board meeting. The room was full of executives, shareholders, and lawyers, all waiting for his downfall. Marcus Henderson sat near the head of the table, looking far too confident. Veronica and Nathaniel sat in the back, silent observers. Richard stood, his face calm. "I'm sure you've all seen the headlines," he said. Murmurs rippled through the room. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "It's unfortunate, really," he said, faking concern. "But in times like these, the board must consider what's best for the company." Translation. They were planning to force him out. Richard nodded. "I agree." The room fell silent. Marcus blinked. "Excuse me." Richard dropped a thick stack of documents onto the table. "Which is why I'd like to introduce some new evidence." The air in the room shifted. Veronica watched as Marcus tensed. Richard flipped to the first page. "These financial transactions," he said smoothly. "The ones I supposedly approved." He pushed a document toward the board members. "They were signed while I was in Hong Kong." Whispers thread through the room. "I was in Hong Kong with 3 of you sitting at this very table," Richard continued, motioning toward 2 board members. "And yet here's my signature on a document I supposedly signed the same day." More whispers. Marcus shifted in his seat. Richard turned to the next page. "And here's where things get interesting," he continued. "We traced the authorization logs." Marcus's face paled. Veronica knew that look. the look of a man who had just realized he was about to lose everything. Richard leaned forward. Marcus Henderson's login credentials were used to approve every single fraudulent transaction. Dead silence. Then, Marcus started. This is... Richard lifted a hand. Before you speak, he said, his voice deceptively calm, I'd like you to know that this meeting is being recorded. Marcus's mouth snapped shut. Veronica could practically see the moment he realized he had lost. Richard leaned back. Any final words? Marcus hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook his head. The board members whispered among themselves. Then one of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes, spoke. Mr. Harrington, she said, looking at Richard with new respect, I think we owe you an apology. The aftermath. Marcus Henderson was fired within the hour. A full investigation was launched. And Richard Harrington. He walked out of that boardroom with his reputation intact. Veronica and Nathaniel followed him outside. The city air was crisp, the weight of the last few days settling over them. Richard turned to Veronica. You didn't have to help me, he said quietly. Veronica shrugged. Yeah, well, maybe I didn't want to lose you again. Richard's breath hitched. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. I was going to wait, he said, but I want you to have this. She hesitated before taking it. Inside was a key. To what? She asked. Richard smiled softly. To your home. Her heart stopped. A home. Not just a house. Not just a place to sleep. But a home. She looked up at him, her throat tight. Are you sure? She whispered. Richard nodded. I lost you once, Veronica, he said, his voice full of emotion. I won't lose you again. And for the first time in years, she believed him. A home to call her own. A key to more than just a house. Veronica stared at the key in her palm. It felt too heavy. Not physically, but in its meaning. For so long, she had believed that home was just a word, that it was something other people had. Something she would never have again. But here it was, in her hands, a door waiting to be opened. Her throat tightened as she looked up at Richard. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. Richard shook his head. No, sweetheart. I want to. Nathaniel watched them, his expression unreadable, but full of quiet support. Veronica swallowed hard. There was a war inside her. One part of her screamed, don't trust it. People leave. People always leave. But the other part, the part that had spent years wishing for this, whispered, what if it's real? What if for once in her life, she didn't have to run? She curled her fingers around the key. Can I see it? She asked hesitantly. Richard smiled, his eyes shining with relief. Of course. The house that waited for her. They drove in silence. Nathaniel sat in the back seat, giving them space. But always there. The ride felt longer than it should have. Or maybe it was just her nerves stretching time. When they pulled up, Veronica sucked in a breath. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't a penthouse. It was a small, beautiful townhouse nestled on a quiet street. The kind of place where people planted flowers in their front yards and waved to their neighbors. It was nothing like the cold, distant wealth she had expected. Richard cleared his throat. I kept this house for you. In case. He trailed off. In case you ever came back. Veronica's fingers trembled as she turned the key in the lock. The door swung open with a soft creak. The inside was warm, cozy furniture, soft lighting, a few framed photos on the walls. It wasn't grand. It wasn't overdone. It was home. Her chest tightened as she took a slow step inside. Everything felt unreal. Could this really be hers? Could she really stay? Richard's voice was gentle. You don't have to decide today, but if you want it, it's yours. Veronica let out a shaky breath. For the first time, she wanted to believe. She turned to Richard, her walls lower than they had ever been. I don't know how to be someone's daughter, she admitted. Richard's face softened. That's okay, he said. I don't know how to fix the past, but we can start with today. Her chest ached. Because maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A life she never thought she'd have. Days turned into weeks. Veronica didn't run. Not this time. She moved in slowly, piece by piece, as if testing to see if the house would disappear if she claimed it as hers. But it didn't. It stayed, just like Richard did, just like Nathaniel did. Richard never forced anything. He simply showed up. Dinner together when she felt like it. Stories about her mother when she asked. Space when she needed it. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to survive every second of the day. She could just exist. And it wasn't perfect. Some nights, she still woke up expecting to be back on the streets. Some mornings, she still hesitated before calling it home. But little by little, it got easier. And then, one evening, she found herself knocking on Richard's study door. He looked up from his papers, surprised. Everything okay? She hesitated. Then, carefully, she held up a photograph. A photo of her mother. Tell me about her. Richard's eyes filled with emotion. And as he began to speak, Veronica sat down, really sat down, feeling, for the first time in forever, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. A future worth holding on to. Nathaniel stopped by a few weeks later, a grin on his face. So, how does it feel? He asked, leaning against the doorframe. Veronica raised an eyebrow. How does what feel? Nathaniel smirked. Having a home. She paused. Then, for the first time, she didn't have to think about it. It feels real. Nathaniel's expression softened. Good. And then, after a long pause, Veronica. She looked at him. I'm proud of you. She blinked, caught off guard. Proud. For what? For not running. For choosing to believe. For learning how to stay. Maybe all of it. She smiled softly. Thanks, Nathaniel. And for once, she actually meant it. The final chapter. A new beginning. It took time. But day by day, piece by piece, Veronica found something she thought she had lost forever. She found a home. She found a family. She found herself. And one evening, as she curled up on the couch with a blanket, listening to her father read from an old book, she realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And that was the real miracle. The one she never saw coming.